the South Fork Natural History Museum. And in recognition of Lyme Disease Awareness Month, I think we feel that as the South Fork Natural History Museum's mission is to continue creating awareness about not just the natural history, but how to enjoy the natural world and protect themselves from Lyme disease and other infections that may occur in the natural environment. So I'm very, very proud to present this, this presentation today because with COVID, the museum was kind of put on hiatus for a while for in-person events like this. So it's really nice that we're starting to come around and getting this, this presentations, in-person presentations back in order here at the museum. So with that said, I'd like to introduce a good friend of mine, advisory council member, and a person that really spearheaded this event. Is Jane Held. So Jane, you want to come up and maybe introduce Dr. Scott Campbell and the rest of the panel?
Okay, today we have a great group of speakers. We've got Dr. Scott Campbell. He is a medical entomologist and chief of the Arthropod-Borne Disease Laboratory for the Suffolk County Department of Health Services. And he strongly believes in the importance of educational outreach to better understand and help prevent tick bites and tick-borne diseases. Dr. Campbell has been involved in public health and research of tick-borne diseases for over 30 years. He and his staff are responsible for countywide surveillance for mosquito-borne and tick-borne pathogens that cause human disease. Dr. Campbell has been or is currently involved with a variety of committees or working groups related to vector-borne disease, including a current member of the Scientific Advisory Panel for the Stony Brook Southampton Hospital Regional Tick-Borne Disease Resource Center. And he has a wealth of knowledge that I think you're all going to enjoy hearing. And following Dr. Campbell, we're going to have Dr. Jerry Simmons talking about treatment, symptoms, and many other things. And we have Dr. George Dempsey, who's going to speak about some research that he's doing. And we also have Rebecca Young from the Stony Brook Southampton Hospital Tick-Borne Disease Resource Center. And so Dr. Scott Campbell, take it away.
Thank you, Jane. It's great to be here. Hopefully you'll learn something along the way. The panelists have a wealth of information and that will be beneficial to anybody that listens to us speak. What I'll be talking about are the medically important tick species found in Suffolk County, the pathogens or germs that they transmit, and how to prevent tick bites, and what you can do around your yard to reduce the risk of ticks around your yard. So here in Suffolk County, there's three main tick species that are of medical importance. We have the black-legged tick, also known as the deer tick, the American dog tick, and the Lone Star tick. So all ticks have the same stages, life stages. The first is the egg, and the egg hatches, and out from the egg comes a six-legged larva. They're very small. They take a blood meal, they molt, and they emerge as a eight-legged nymph. The nymph takes a blood meal and molts into either a female or a male. So all tick species have these stages, and I've had people say over the years, oh, it's a small one, it must be a black-legged tick. But there are small ones, the small stages with the Lone Star ticks as well. So yeah, it's not just the black-legged ticks that are small, it's all the tick species. So here's a photo out of CDC. They're actually black-legged tick nymphs on a poppy seed muffin. They put this out a couple years ago, and they had to actually make sure that people realized that they weren't serving poppy seed muffins with ticks on them. So, but this is just a size comparison. You can see how small they are and really what you need to look for when you're actually doing a tick check at home after being in tick territory. So I mentioned about a blood meal. So a tick takes a blood meal either to molt into the next stage, or the females take a blood meal to produce an egg mass. And that here's a fully engorged black-legged tick female on the left, and then you can see that the egg mass that it's laying on the right, and it lays thousands of eggs. And out of those eggs come thousands of larvae. So that's the process. And it takes, for the adult female, it takes about 7 days for it to become fully engorged. The larvae take about 2 days, the nymphs take about 3 or so. So the smaller ones don't have to feed as long, but the purpose obviously is to fill up with blood and either molt or lay eggs to continue the cycle. And here's the cycle. It's a 2-year life cycle. You can see we'll start with the eggs right here. The eggs hatch into the 6-legged larva. It feeds on smaller hosts. It overwinters and emerges after molting as a nymph. The nymph feeds on the hosts, and then it will digest the meal and actually emerge later that season in fall or winter as an adult tick, either a male or a female. They mate, the female feeds, and will lay eggs the following spring, and the cycle continues. If you look at this, you can see that this shaded area is the greatest risk of infection, and that is due to the nymph. Even though the nymph infection rate for Lyme disease is half of the adults, it's greater risk in the summertime because the nymphs are smaller and less likely to be found during a tick check. So you can see, that poppy seed size, it's very, very important to do very, very thorough tick checks. And the other thing is that these adults are active in winter when the degree day is above 40 degrees. So if you have a warm winter day, those ticks are active and can be seeking a host. So you really have to take precautions in the winter as well on warmer days. So really, throughout the whole year, you're going to have the risk of being bitten by ticks and acquiring potential diseases from the bite. So we're going to have some medical staff talk about the diseases, so I will briefly touch upon this. And so these are the tick-borne diseases that the black-legged tick transmits. We all know Lyme disease, most prevalent tick-borne illness. Anaplasmosis is another. Both of them are bacterial, treated by antibiotics. The babesiosis is another one we have. It's more like malaria. It's a protozoal disease, which also can be treated. Borrelia Miyamoto disease is a bacterial infection, less likely to be found. It's rarer. But again, bacterial can be treated with antibiotics. Powassan virus or deer tick virus are also found in the ticks. They're obviously viral diseases. They can be treated with supportive care, but there's really no antibiotics you can take. The good thing about Powassan virus is the infection rate in ticks is very low. But again, most tick-borne illnesses are like flu-like symptoms. Malaise, fever, rashes are also common in many of them. So if you have flu-like symptoms during the summer, it's more than likely that you should think along the lines of possible tick-borne illness. So the rash, this is the classic bullseye rash. You have the center of the bite, and then you have the expanding rash from that site. So if you see a erythema migrans rash or a bullseye rash, it's certain that you've been infected with the germ that causes Lyme disease. So we also find multiple germs in ticks. So you can have, from one tick, you can get multiple pathogens and get multiple diseases. So it's very rare. It's single digits, but it is a possibility. So you have to think along those lines as well. So I talked about the blood meals, and where do these ticks get the pathogens or germs that cause these diseases? They get them from the blood meal. So for the black-legged tick, the white-footed mouse is the reservoir for the pathogens that cause Lyme disease, anaplasmosis, babesiosis, and Powassan. So an unaffected tick feeds on a mouse that's infected with those germs, will take it up, and on the subsequent meal, the next meal, it can transmit it to another mouse or a human. And that's how that infection is transmitted. Deer are an important reproductive host, the adults, actually feed and mate on the deer, but they don't get any pathogens, at least for the black-legged tick. They don't get any pathogens from the deer. It's the mouse that is the culprit, but they need both species of hosts to continue that life cycle. There are other animals that are involved, but these two are the primary ones that kind of get the idea across of how it all works. But there are other rodents, birds can all be involved in the cycle. So I just try to keep it as simple as possible. So the American dog tick is the second tick species, and I only have the male and female because the larvae and nymphs only feed on rodents. They will not bite humans. They're very specific to rodents, so we don't have to worry about being bitten by those life stages. But you can see here's a female and here's a male. So they will attach. The males don't really feed, but it's the female that can transmit pathogens or germs. So when are they active? They're active during this time, the spring, into the summer. All right. So right now, basically, you have black-legged ticks active, and you have dog ticks, and you also have Lone Star ticks, which we'll talk about in a second. But that's when the adults are active and can bite you. What do they transmit? Rocky Mountain spotted fever is the primary disease that you acquire from American dog ticks, but they can also transmit tularemia, and they feed on meadow voles and foxes, and they're more of a tick that's found in fields. So you're going to find them in fields, and that's why they feed on meadow voles. Lone Star ticks, a relatively newcomer to Suffolk County. Around 2000 or so, they started to really expand westward. You can see that all the different stages, you have a larval, a nymph, and then the two adults, and I have them all up there because they will all attach to humans. They will all bite. So when are they active? They too follow the same activity, like coming out in the spring, going into the summer, the nymphs and the adults. In the adults that come out will lay eggs. The females that feed now will lay eggs, and they will hatch, and then you have an emergence of larvae in the late summer, early fall into October, November. And there is what is referred to out here in the East End as chiggers. So true chiggers are mites. We don't have them in Suffolk County. So it's a misnomer to call them chiggers. They're larval Lone Star ticks. And so chiggers where they're found are found all summer long, from May through to the fall. Here, we only find them when their larval Lone Star ticks are active late in the season, like in summer, early fall. So that's a misnomer. So, and this is what they look like, and that's probably why they refer to them as chiggers, because the bites are the end result, that inflamed bite is very similar to what chiggers do down south. But these are larval Lone Star tick bites. You get that aggravated bite that itches like crazy. Larval Lone Star tick bites, period, itch like crazy, but especially when you're bitten by, this number of larval Lone Star ticks, you will get that kind of bite pattern on your lower limbs usually. All right, so what do they transmit? Ehrlichiosis is the primary disease that they transmit. It's bacterial, treated with antibiotics. Tularemia is also transmitted by Lone Star ticks. We have found the agent, or the germ that causes tularemia in Lone Star ticks in Suffolk County, so that is another risk. And we've actually recently found both Heartland virus and Bourbon virus in this county as well, in the Lone Star ticks. These infection rates are very low, but it is a possibility that Heartland or Bourbon it can be transmitted from the Lone Star tick population here in Suffolk County. Alpha-gal meat allergy is not a germ, it's an allergy, as it states. And basically, it's exposure to the alpha-gal in the saliva. It's a carbohydrate or sugar that we don't have naturally in our body. Our immune system sees it as foreign, creates antibodies to that alpha-gal molecule, and the antibodies that we produce sometimes will cause, depending on the individual and how high the exposure, will cause a reaction when we eat red meat where it's found naturally in other hoofed mammals, veal, venison, pork. It's not found in chicken or fish. So any poultry or fish you can eat, but in any kind of red meat, if you are been sensitized to alpha-gal, you can have a reaction. So you can see there's no rodents here. For Lone Star ticks, the primary host are deer. And that's why we've seen such an increase. We've seen an increase in the deer population locally and moving westward. And with that, we see a westward movement of Lone Star ticks and diseases caused by Lone Star ticks. So this is just a snapshot of the number of cases that we've seen over the years reported. All these tick-borne illnesses are reportable. You can kind of see, it's up and down. It depends a lot on how it's reported, if it's reported. But this kind of gives you an idea on what's going on with regards to tick-borne illnesses in Suffolk County. With COVID over the last few years, probably reporting has suffered when it comes to tick-borne illnesses, and so you have to keep that in mind if you're looking at actually the number of cases. But most of these tick-borne illnesses seem to either stabilize or slightly increasing. Nothing drastic, at least that's what we see when we look at the numbers. So tick habitat, where do you find these ticks? So the black-legged tick, a lot of what drives where you find them is the hosts, which we've already talked about, and also the ability for them not to desiccate. So if they really want moist environment, they're going to be found in woodlands. That's where there's more moisture. And the black-legged tick is very susceptible to desiccation. So you find them where you find mice and deer in moist areas like woodlands, and that's why we find them in those locations. American dog tick, as I mentioned, feed on meadow voles and foxes, so they're not as susceptible to desiccation as black-legged ticks, and that's why you find them in fields. Lone Star ticks are also not very susceptible to desiccation, so you can really find them anywhere because you have deer in woods and fields and homes, and so they have more of a diverse ecology and where you can find them in different locations. And you can find all of these species in lawns and peri-domestic areas. You can find them around your home. And that's really why we're here, is that most people probably are bitten around their homes because that's when they kind of let their guard down with regard to tick bites. They go out to get tomatoes. They go out to walk the dog. The dog goes out and comes in. If you go to a park, you're going to be more conscious probably when it comes to looking for ticks. So you have to really think that a risky area is around homes where you might not really think that it is a location where ticks may be. So you really have to think about that as well. How do you come in contact with ticks? Ticks quest. And that means they just will basically ambush a host. They sit on vegetation with their arms out. As the host goes by, they latch on with their claws on the end of their legs, and they go off with the host. Ticks will also, especially Lone Star ticks and American dog ticks to a lesser degree, they will actually go to a host if they sense carbon dioxide. So they'll go onto a deck, onto pavers. They will do that if they sense that CO2. But most ticks will quest. They don't want to expend the energy, but they will come after you if they do get the CO2 plume from exhalation. So, but questing is it, and that's what you kind of think of when it comes to preventing tick bites. So most ticks are found in leaf litter, grass, shrubbery, depending on the life stage. So you kind of have to think from the knees down. They don't drop from trees. They're not in trees. They don't really go above like knee height. So that's from basically the waist down is where you want to think of a dangerous area for ticks. So how do you prevent tick bites? You basically you want to prevent contact with ticks. So if you can stay out of tick territory, all the better. If you're going into tick territory, there are things you can do to prevent tick bites. So you want to stay in the center of paths, because once you go off that path into leaf litter or tall grass, you're going to increase your risk of contacting ticks. Obviously, you don't want to just sit on ground or leaf litter or anything like that, or even walk through it if you don't have to. There's 2 layers that you can use to prevent that contact with ticks and your skin. It's cloth and it's repellents. So the first is the cloth, and by wearing long pants, tucking pants into socks, you're creating a barrier for the ticks that they can't get up underneath that clothing. Tucking your shirt into your pants, you'll prevent ticks from getting in underneath your shirt and getting into the area of the skin that way. You also want to do frequent tick checks in the field as well as at home. When you get home after being in tick territory, you want to do a full tick check. And I like to do a tick check the following day, because if you find a little nymph or you missed a little nymph and it starts to bite you, now it's a little bigger because that redness around the bite site is, so you're going to be more likely to find it the day after it attached. So you really want to take a look at that as well. So always do. It's always good to just get into the habit of doing tick checks when you brush your teeth. That's what I tell people to do. When you brush your teeth, do a quick tick check if you can. And then the other thing is you can consider using tick repellents. There's 2 different ways. One is on skin. So if you want to wear shorts and you want to protect yourself, you can apply tick repellent to your legs, for example. If you're going to just wear clothing, you can actually apply tick repellent to your clothing. And there's the ones that wash off, like DEET and picaridin, and then there's ones that bind to the clothing, like permethrin. So the permethrin sprays are only used on clothing. They bind to the clothing. They last a long time, and up to 6 washings. If you actually dip your clothing, have them dipped by there's a company that does that. That's what the military does. You can actually wash them 70 times. So this permethrin is a very, very good barrier. There's no skin risk of skin contact. You don't really, it doesn't affect you. So it's a very, very good way. You're not putting the pesticide or the repellent on your skin, and there's no contact. And as I mentioned, ticks don't like desiccation. So whenever you're out in tick territory, when you come home, first thing you do is take your clothing, throw it in a dryer, 10 minutes on medium or high. That will desiccate the ticks and kill them. And if you put them in a hamper, they'll live for a couple days in a hamper. If you throw in a washer with hot soap, bleach, hot water, soap, bleach, it'll survive that washing. It won't kill them. And then anybody taking it out of the washer and put it in the dryer, that there's a possibility of exposure. So the best thing you can do is take your clothing off, put it right in the dryer, hit it, dry it for 10 minutes, and do your tick check, do your shower, and then your clothing can go back in the hamper. It can sit in there, and you don't have to worry about it with regards to bringing ticks into the house. So again, I talked about that layering. So here you have the layers, right? On the boots, it can't get under here, and then it gives you more time to find them as they're crawling up that clothing. Here's another way people do it. They just extend that area. You can apply permethrin to any of this, and then it's another barrier for ticks to get into any place that they can find skin. So again, frequent tick checks in the field and at home. And I mentioned the next morning. Clothes dryers, they're our best friend, really. They're very, very effective at treating. And so where do you look for tick checks? It's basically everywhere. But again, if you wear long pants, the likelihood of having them under your long pants if they're tucked in your socks is very, very low. Maybe you didn't really get the sock up all the way and one slipped by, but if you're pretty thorough with that layer of cloth and the possibility of using repellents, you're going to reduce the possibility of where you may find them. Kids have a tendency to find them more around the head, probably because they're smaller and it takes less time for them to get around the ears and nape of the neck. But for adults, it's more likely to find them in the groin area, in the armpits, and the axillary areas. But again, so using as much coverage with repellents and clothing, you're going to reduce the likelihood of getting tick bites. So this is very interesting. I love this picture. It's actually 3 pictures of erythema migrans, right? The bullseye rash. So you have this one, the back, right, behind. You have this one behind the knee, and you have this one behind the arm. So these are all areas that probably were missed when it came to a tick check, because it's easy to check the front, but it's the back. So you can use mirrors, you can use a spouse. There's ways to do a full tick check. But again, if you're wearing long pants, you're probably not going to get bitten on the legs, right? If you have your waist tucked in, your shirt tucked into your waist, you may not get tick bites on your back. But you need to really check thoroughly and behind you as well. And also, erythema migrans will have different shades. So on lighter skin, it'll have the typical bullseye rash, but it may look, on darker skin, it may look like a bruise. So you have to think about that as well. All right, so the repellents. So if you go on the CDC website, they list the ones that are EPA approved. And the EPA approvals is basically, there's been science tested, they know how long it lasts and how often you have to apply it. If it's not EPA approved, all that's in question. So if there's some science behind it, it gives you a better idea of how long these repellents last. And we talked about the permethrin on clothing only, and then you have the DEET and the picarid, and these 2 are probably the most prevalent that I see in the products that are sold around here. And the other ones can be found and can be used in products as well, but you can find these 3 primarily in the products that we find in department stores, sporting goods stores, hardware stores. You can get these anywhere in those types of stores. And also, I have to put it, mosquitoes will also transmit disease. West Nile and Eastern equine encephalitis are found in Suffolk County. So these are labeled for ticks and mosquitoes. And so if you're getting bitten by either, you want to just follow the instructions. And as they say, label is the law. So you want to follow the directions. It says reapply after 4 hours, reapply after 4 hours. If it says don't apply to the face, don't do that. Follow the label, and you will be good to go. Pets. I'm going to just briefly touch upon pets. Pets are also susceptible to tick bites and tick-borne pathogens, but also when it comes to what we're talking about here, they can bring ticks into the house. So you want to do tick checks on dogs and cats as well. If they go out, they can bring ticks in, do a quick tick check, use products that are tick safe, repellents that will reduce the risk of ticks on these pets. Talk to your veterinarian, find out what you should be using. But really, you want to prevent them from bringing in ticks and transmitting them into the house onto a couch where you're sitting. You may not even leave the house, and now you're at risk of acquiring a tick bite because you had the dog that went out and brought it in. So you have to think about that as part of the equation as well. Okay, so that's the basics on the ticks, the pathogens or germs that they transmit. So how do they actually do it? So the mouth part is that this is the only piece that actually it goes into the skin. So it ends there. You can get swelling around it, so it looks like it's like in further, but that is the only part of the tick that actually goes into the skin. These two structures here, they're called palps. They can't get into the skin anyway. So they turn to the side, as you'll see right here. There are the palps right here, and so there's no way for that tick to get in. So how to remove a tick? The best way is to use very fine tip tweezers and just grasp the tick as close to the skin as possible and pull straight up. Don't twist. You definitely don't want to squeeze the body of the tick. The gut is in there, and that's where those pathogens are. You don't want to squeeze those germs into the bite site. So just grab it close to the skin and pull it straight out. So remove the tick as quickly as possible. The longer a tick is attached, the greater the risk for tick-borne illness, because it takes time for those germs to be transmitted from the tick into the bite. And it depends on the germ. It can be very quick. The viruses seem to be more readily passed more quickly in that length of time, whereas the germs that cause Lyme disease and the other ones take 24, 36 hours or so. So you have time, but you want to do thorough tick checks. Better to get them off when they haven't attached. As soon as you find one, you want to get it off as quickly as possible. All right, and what you want to do is you want to keep that tick. It's a medical reference, right? So now if you get sick in a week or 2 weeks, you have a tick, you know what you actually were bitten by, you can take it to your medical provider and show it to them, and that will give them a piece of the puzzle, okay, that they can better treat you with, okay? All right, so tick removal and what to do if you do find a tick. And then we'll quickly talk about some tick management, and this is what people can do around their homes or any areas that, like a park could do the same thing to try to reduce ticks in the outdoors. So we'll talk about landscape modification, host abundance. We already talked about where the hosts are. You can target those hosts with host-targeted tick control. Then you can actually target the ticks, or you can use integrated pest management. And that's probably the most important thing, is that there's no one silver bullet. You really have to look at the big picture and do as much of these little things as possible to try to reduce ticks. There's a tick management handbook by Kirby Stafford. That a lot of the information that I'll be discussing goes into much greater depth into this book. You can find it online or at our website. One thing you can do also is this is how we collect ticks. So we can do tick collection. You can do tick collection around your home, and you can actually see if you have a tick problem, or where the ticks, if you have a dog that never leaves the backyard, keeps coming in with ticks, you can actually get a piece of cloth, attach it to a broom handle, and go through the yard and find out exactly where the dog is picking up the ticks, because it'll attach. The ticks are questing, right? And they'll put their legs out and they'll attach themselves to that piece of cloth. And as you take that by, you'll be able to find exactly where those ticks are, okay? And then it may just be the one location, so either you can treat that area, target that area for tick management, or you can keep the kids or the pets away from that area as well. So there's that you can use that as a strategy when it comes to tick management. So ticks don't like dryness. So one way to reduce or increase dryness in your yard is to remove leaf litter. By removing leaf litter, the environment becomes drier, and there'll be less rodent activity as well. So that's one thing you can do. It's an easy fix, right? The other thing is any kind of brush, any kind of plantings can harbor ticks with the moisture and rodents. So if you have an area that's just overgrown, that you don't know what to do with, if you remove that, you're going to reduce the likelihood of ticks being in that area. So and I'm not saying go in with a big mower and mow everything down, but we were able, by showing that by reducing all that cat briar, we dried the area out, we reduced the number of ticks in that area. So Lawn maintenance. You want to keep the grass short. Keeping it short keeps it drier, right? You don't want, and also when it comes to the grass, you don't want to cut along the edge and blow or shoot the grass into the yard. You want to shoot it outside because ticks most likely are going to come from the edge. That's the dangerous area, is the edge of a yard or a location. So you want to either bag it or shoot it away from the center of the yard. Watering. Again, they like moisture. So the moister your lawn, or the more moist the lawn, the more likelihood that the survival of the ticks will be greater. So you don't need to live in the Sahara, but you just have to remember that by watering, you don't want it too wet. So, and then you can also do the tick surveillance on your lawn to find out if there is a problem, right? Physical barriers. Okay, so you have this fence right here, and it's not going to keep the deer out. It's not going to keep the rodents out. But you know what? It may keep a child from going into this area chasing a frisbee or a ball. So it stops that exposure. So and then a mulch barrier like this is another way. It's a barrier. People will come up to it and stop. You know, they typically won't run through that. Mulch is a very dry surface. So there may be some prevention of the ticks coming over that dry surface into the yard. So by having a dry area like that will reduce the likelihood of ticks coming into that area. Hardened walkways are better than grass or leaf litter. So if you have an area, a walkway to some location on your property, a hardened walkway is going to be less riskier for ticks than a vegetative or leafy one. Play areas. Play areas, you can see that this one is pea gravel, and you want it as far away from the property edge as possible. I see a lot of this with playgrounds close to property edges. That's where people put them. You don't put them in the middle of your front yard. But it is what it is. You want to make sure that you're cognizant that edge is a riskier place. That dryness right there is like mulch, right? That pea gravel, you're going to have less travel of ticks over that. Okay, so the next is host abundance, right? You want to keep hosts, deer, mice, from coming into your property. So by doing some things around your property, you're going to reduce that. One is if you see this browse line, right? You know you have visitors, right? You've got deer coming into your yard at night probably and eating all the leaves from this browse line down. So if you see that, you know that deer are coming into your yard. So you can reduce that by putting in deer-resistant plants. So talk to the local nurseries. It varies from location to location. I know some locations will say, oh yeah, they don't eat daffodils. In other places they'll say, oh yeah, they eat my daffodils all the time. So by talking to local nurseries, you'll know what is deer resistant and what isn't. But by reducing that forage for deer, you're going to reduce the risk of deer coming into in your yard, okay, where they can potentially drop ticks and expose you to tick bites. Brush piles, wood piles are like condos for rodents. Rodents love to live under these things. So if you have brush like this, it's best just to get rid of it. Again, it's a moist harborage for rodents. Same thing with wood piles. You want to try to get them off the ground. So again, a wood pile like this is riskier than a wood pile like this. If you have wood, you want to get it up off the ground. Just put it on you can find skids. People, these pallets, people throw them out. Just put a couple in the backyard, stack your wood on it, and then the mice can't go underneath them. Underneath the wood piles. Rock walls are also harborages for rodents. They can fit into these little areas. Again, you just need to know that they may be there. This is a house that I went to. There's my flag right there. They were complaining, the owner was complaining that their children were getting bitten. coming in with ticks on them, and the dog too. So I flagged, and what was happening was there were mouse burrows along the ground edge where the grass met this wall, and I was collecting ticks. As they were feeding on the mice and coming out and questing outside of the burrows. So I would pick them up with the flag there. Feeding wildlife, again, if you're not feeding them with the plantings, you definitely don't want to feed deer with corn, right? For one, it's illegal. In the state of New York, you're not allowed to feed deer, but people do. But when you're bringing them in like that, you're increasing the risk of them dropping ticks off into your yard. Birds, I love birds, and I love feeding birds, especially hummingbirds. But again, this setup is in the far corner of this residence, where you can see that there's seed that's falling out of these feeders. The rodents are coming in and feeding on that seed. So you're bringing rodents in, but again, put it in an area where the kids and pets are less likely to come in contact with it. Deer fencing is tough. Deer can clear a 6-foot, 8-foot fence very easily. They're less likely to go through a solid fence because they don't know what's on the other side. So shorter solid fences appear to be better than the chain link. But most deer fences, the ones that are really effective, are at an angle. There's a diagonal. So they come from outside and they can't get up that angle. These are straight, and you can see that this one has barbed wire on the top. But a lot of problems with, the problem with deer fencing is zoning. A lot of zoning areas don't allow a fence higher than 4 foot. Well, they can easily go over a 4-foot fence, or even a 6-foot fence. So it's kind of, if you can use it, it's something that you can use to reduce deer from coming into your fence, into your yard rather. But it is a zoning issue. You can target rodents. So Daminex or tick tubes. These are cotton balls that are laced with permethrin. The mouse comes, takes the cotton ball, takes it back to the burrow, sleeps in it, and the permethrin kills the ticks that are on the mice as they sleep. Unfortunately, they don't have a deer bed that is cotton like that, and that might be a good way to go, but there's something that's similar that I will tell you about in a second. Here's another system that for rodents, the mice go in to feed on a bait that's in there, and as it goes in, it gets wicked with a pesticide, and it kills the ticks on the rodents that way. So the select tick control system is available, but it can only be applied to a residential area by a certified applicator. You can't buy that. The tick tubes you can buy at a hardware store and do it yourself, but this system can only be applied by a certified applicator. So this is kind of like what we have for deer, and this is called the 4-poster deer bait station. And the deer come in to eat corn. The corn is kept in this hopper. It goes into both sides. The deer comes in to eat it into this well, and as it eats, it brushes up against permethrin that's in those rollers. And so it's kind of like those cotton balls, right? But here it's applied in a liquid form to the deer. They have to groom and move it around, but where it has been used, it usually is effective if done properly. This can only be done on a municipality level or a park level. You need some space. It's DEC regulated, so it's not something that you can get on your property per se. You'd have to be part of a larger program through the town, let's say. Okay, so that's host targeted. Now we're going to target ticks with arcaricides or pesticides directly, right? You're going to spray areas where there is risk. So property edges are kind of, I've already mentioned this, but edges typically are where you're going to see most of the tick activity on a property. You're not really going to find it in the center of a backyard. You can, but most of the risk is going to be at the edges, where in these woods or fields are the animals, the hosts that are going to drive the tick populations. So you may just be able to just deal with tick management in the edge of a property and not worry about the center of a property. So how do we do that? Again, if you can do tick surveillance in a property by really targeting or finding out where these ticks can be found, that's the best thing to do. Timely applications. You saw those bell-shaped curves of the tick population. You don't want to apply pesticide at the end of the curve. You want to do it at the beginning of the curve. A lot of these pesticides that are used have long residuals, up to 90 days. So you can do one application early in the season, and it will be most of the season. Maybe a reapplication for the fall. But if you do tick surveillance, with a flag, piece of cloth, you can actually see how effective it's been and if you need to reapply. So you want to be able to target a location. You don't have to spray the entire yard, perhaps. If you have, you may have to, but you may not have to. And then again, any acaricide or pesticide that's sprayed on a property has to be followed by the label. Okay. So. We have some great partners in tick bite prevention. We have a lot of information on our website. We have a tick surveillance program that is on our website. We have sites in every township in Suffolk County, and we go there every year and we look at tick infection rates at that, and it's just kind of a snapshot. It's not a given, it fluctuates, infection rates fluctuate year to year for the various pathogens. But we also have a email address, both for tick questions and mosquito questions that residents can send inquiries into, and we respond. Also, New York State Department of Health, they have information on their websites, and CDC has plenty of information as well. We're lucky to be a great partner with Stony Brook, Southampton Hospital, Tick-Borne Disease Resource Center. We partner with them on a lot of our talks. Rebecca is the person at the end of the helpline, so if you have any medical questions, it's a good place to call, and she'll talk more about that later. And then they also provide the tick removal kits. They're designed to be efficient with those fine tip tweezers, and everybody that was here today got one. If you weren't here and you want one, you can call the helpline and leave your information to have one mailed to you, or you can email Karen Wolfrat, the director of the Resource Center, and she will send you one as well. As well as we have a lot of good written information about the various tick-borne illnesses as well. I have a great staff in my lab, Lexi, Chris, and Mike. Interns really drive a lot of what we do. A big thank you to the Resource Center. And that's all I have, and I hope you've learned something. Without further ado, I will introduce Jerry Simmons, South Fork's very own.
So my name is Jerry Simmons. I also work with the Tick Center at Stony Brook, Southampton, and I'm a professor at Stony Brook, and I lecture at Weill Cornell Graduate School. I've worked with Global Lyme Alliance and written Lyme articles. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the news with Lyme disease and some of the ideas about treatment. So again, you've already seen our great tick removal kit. If you haven't picked one up, Rebecca will have some for you. And if you're watching the SOFO news live, you'll be able to email us for one. Again, I'll remind you about that. So guess what? Whether you're here in the room or whether you're streaming in the middle of winter from the SOFO website, we're all going to take a quiz together. So here we go. Ticks only make you sick if they're attached more than 24 hours. True or false? We'll give you the answers at the end. Lyme is the only serious tick illness. And again, you hopefully got the answer to that. Alpha-gal meat allergy can be deadly. Everyone with Lyme remembers the tick bite. The CDC says a positive Lyme test is required to diagnose Lyme. A tick can give you more than one illness. A summer flu could be a tick illness. You could only get a tick bite in warm weather, and 80 to 90% of people get over Lyme easily. Again, true or false, we're gonna figure out the answers at the end. So there's been a lot of Lyme disease in the news, and those of us like Rebecca, me, Scott, that have been dealing with Lyme for decades are excited that there's finally talk about Lyme disease in the news. Number one, people, please. Hello? It's not Lymes with a Z or an S at the end. It's just Lyme, right? Someone's at King Cullen, they're like, oh, I've got limes. I'm like, what is that? The fruit, right? You mean Lyme, right? So Lyme disease is a bacteria, which is this little like classic corkscrew shape. And of course the germ can make people and pets sick. And there are many different variations. So Lyme in the news. One of the most interesting things about Lyme in the news is the effect of Lyme and climate change. And there's a lot of data that with global warming and climate change, as deer and rodent migration changes and winter temperatures change, that Lyme also as well. People, look at this. Looking at Lyme disease as a vector in Canada. And over the last decade, they've actually been able to document that Lyme is moving 4 kilometers north every year into Canada. People, you listening? There are towns and villages in Canada that never even knew what Lyme is. And now you're seeing more and more that Lyme is moving north, right? Looking at these higher temperature changes. Again, Lyme is all over the news, right? Justin Bieber. Everybody thought Justin was high on crack and doing drugs and acting crazy, but it ended up that he actually had Lyme disease. He had an IV in his arm, very well documented in the news, and now he's like back on tour, right? You might remember Chris Christopherson was eventually put in a nursing home because he couldn't control his bowels, he didn't know who he was, he had severe pain and headaches, and looking at the history, the wife walked in, well, someone give my husband, Chris Christopherson, $30 worth of doxycycline, and he started turning around, and he went back on tour, things like that. Alec Baldwin, we see him at Kmart all the time, right, around town, came out in People magazine with Lyme disease affecting his joints. Even Sag Harbor Express, right, talking about some good news, the 4-poster system, which a lot of us in the room are big fans of, really helping to reduce tick population. And again, as we heard, according to the CDC and Dr. Campbell, ticks really can bite all year round. If you've got that 40, 42, 45 degree temperature, even in January, February, the ticks could come out, right? So think about that. Look at this tick, coming out of the ice. Just 2 days ago, it was a lead story on the Today Show about a guy who went camping in his 30s and got severe carditis. He got Lyme carditis, almost needed a pacemaker because his heart rate went so low. A friend of mine, Charles Balducci, the same exact story happened. So, right, ended up in the ICU as a rare complication of Lyme. So there's also news about where people are treated for Lyme and the symptoms don't go away, right? Where you've got symptoms for a long period of time, right? If you saw, this was a great article in the Wall Street Journal, The Lonely Odyssey of Chronic Disease. The person ended up having Lyme. Or everybody knows Ross Dothon, you see him in Montauk sometimes, writing on how he became a sick person, right? These are really amazing articles about people's journeys with Lyme disease. This I thought was really interesting. As they were studying the deer population, I don't know how they did this, probably Dr. Campbell could explain it. They were also testing the deer for COVID and found that up to 40% of white-tailed deer were also carrying COVID. and transmitting it through to different hosts and things like that. So again, people, surprise, right? You're seeing deer with both ticks and transmitting COVID. We'll come back another day for another lecture on this. So just a quick shout out to Dr. Campbell, who adopted my son scientifically, Jerry Jr., who did a study on local parks during COVID, Massachusetts Park and through Sag Harbor, and he noticed that the parks during COVID were overflowing with people. I'm like, so Jerry Jr., what do you think that means? He's like, well, more people from the city are escaping COVID. They are running through all of our parks. And I'm like, okay, and what else? He's like, maybe they don't know about Lyme. So he stood by our parks and surveyed people and got their info and followed up with them and found that people with zip codes from Manhattan had higher levels of tick and didn't know about the symptoms and actually ended up getting more Lyme disease. And the National Entomology Association picked up his info, so you could find him online. Pretty cool. Also really interesting news for 2020, Powassan virus, which is a highly transmittable virus which can be transmitted in just a few minutes of a tick bite. Pennsylvania Department of Health is alerting people in March that there's a little cluster of Powassan virus, which is being transmitted by ticks. Powassan, kind of like Lyme disease, fever, headache, vomiting, weakness, and neurologic symptoms. So Powassan, we've got some cases in New York as well. One of my personal things is fighting to save our moose population. Most of you know that there are less than 800 wild moose left in New York, and Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont also dealing with devastating effects of the moose population. And they've actually found that there can be 47,000 ticks on a moose as an average. Some have up to 200,000, and they're literally draining the moose of their blood, the baby moose calves, even adults, right? So as winter's warm, blood-sucking ticks drain the moose. So you might see that famous t-shirt around town, save the moose, right? So again, when I was in college, we always said, save the whales, but now we're trying to save the moose. So that's really, really interesting. So let's talk a little bit, that's just like what's going on in the world of Lyme and news and social media, but let's talk a little bit about symptoms and treatment. If you've ever watched The Real Housewives, Yolanda Hadid published a book all about the different treatments and trials that she actually did during Lyme disease. So really interesting, the CDC defines Lyme disease as infection with the bacteria Borrelia burgdorferi. But as Dr. Campbell hinted at, there are lots of different types of Lyme and Borrelia. In fact, another definition from Dr. Dempsey's Mayo Clinic, they define Lyme on their website as being Borrelia burgdorferi, Mayoni, Afzeli, or Guerinii. So there is data that shows that a tick can have more than one kind of Lyme disease, which is why sometimes people need to have more than one treatment for Lyme. So hopefully you know how to keep ticks out of your yard, to check for ticks, use the dryer. So how do we diagnose Lyme? So the CDC website, I just updated this yesterday, people that have signs and symptoms of Lyme, a chance that they've been exposed to ticks. So, you know, if you're up in the Alaska or Arctic where there's not a lot of ticks, we're not really thinking of that, right? Possibility that other symptoms can cause this, so you've been checked for other diseases, and lab when you need it. It's interesting that the CDC doesn't officially require a Lyme test on their criteria, just these main things: symptoms, exposure, and ruling out other issues. So early on, 3 to 30 days, like we like to call it, like that summer flu, right? Fever, chills, headache, joint ache, swollen lymph glands, right? And you can have that erythema migrans rash. We already saw a bunch of different pictures. It can look a lot of different ways. It's not always that classic bullseye rash. Interesting, there's another disease down south called Stony, southern tick-associated rash, which is not bacterial, but it kind of looks the same way, right? And we know that that one tick can give you different kinds of Lyme and can give you other infections as well. So again, just some illustrations, right? They can look, some people may think that they have like a cellulitis, like a skin infection, but if it clears over time, you get that little central clearing or a central bite site. So again, we've all got cell phones. There's nothing better than taking a picture of your rash, even seeing how it changes over time. So, when we think of these 3 to 30 days, right, erythema migrans can occur in 70 to 80% of people. Dr. Campbell was saying if you've got the tick behind your knee, in your hair, in your back, you may never even see the rash, right? So that's important to remember. And look at this, it begins at the site of a tick bite 3 to 30 days after. So if you're vacationing in Bridgehampton, going to SOFO and maybe going to Stony, and you get a tick on you, and then you go back to, South Dakota or wherever home is, that rash may develop when you're far away from here, right? Which is one of the reasons why we've seen Lyme reported in more than just tick endemic areas. It can expand gradually, even getting as big as 12 inches or even more. It may feel warm, not rarely itchy, and sometimes it clears and gives you that classic bullseye type of a pattern. Later stages can occur days to even months. And this isn't people blowing hot air. I just cut and paste this right from the CDC. This is where people are getting severe headaches, neck stiffness, right? We call it the Lyme disease shrug. People are walking around like pulling their shoulders up, trying to crack their neck, right? The Lyme shrug. They can get facial palsy, that facial droop, intermittent pain, tendons, muscles, joints, heart palpitations, dizzy, nerve pain, right? So again, this could be anything. COVID, the flu, lots of things could give these symptoms. So you have to keep a high rate of suspicion. There's that classic looking like Montauk knee, that one-sided like joint swelling and arthritis. So, right, CDC, days to months after. One of my favorite mottos, besides save the moose, my other famous motto is bitten September, sick in November, right? Because you can have a delay in the manifestation of all these different infections. So we divide Lyme into different stages, the earlier and then the later stages. If we're thinking of later stages, these weeks to months, that's where we're thinking of more neurologic symptom. The germ has gone from the skin and now it's moving around, getting into all the different parts of your body. Things like meningitis and radicular pain, shooting pain all around your body. Very often we can find Borrelia burgdorferi in your cerebral spinal fluid if you've had a tick bite and you're having these symptoms. The Lyme carditis, which we were talking about, just featured on the Today Show, and the Infectious Disease Society of America says Lyme carditis peaks around 21 days. So again, people, if you're at Poxabog or you're at Massachusetts Park and you go home after your vacation 3 weeks from now, who knows where you are when this could manifest. And Lyme arthritis, especially in the knees. So again, these are all of those late symptoms from the CDC website, right? Headache, neck stiffness, facial palsy, dizziness, heart palpitation, shooting pain, problem with short-term memory. One of the things to remember is you're having more than one part of the body involved. You've got joint, you've got neurologic, you've got fatigue, so there's a lot of different things going on. So when people ask me about defining Lyme disease, Dr. Benjamin Luft, who's another person in our Tick Center, published this great definition. And Lyme disease is a multi-systemic tick-borne infection. So if someone's like, Jerry, I have a headache, it must be Lyme disease. I'm like, I don't think so. Or somebody's like, oh, my joints are killing me, it must be Lyme. I'm like, I don't know. But if they have a headache and joint pain, or fatigue and joint pain, multiple parts of the body involved, that's where we start thinking Lyme, right? Caused by the slowly dividing spirochete Borrelia burgdorferi. Now, a strep throat, you can give antibiotics for 5 days and you're cured. But this is one of the reasons why you need 3 weeks or more of the Lyme of treating the Lyme germ. The organism is able to evade host immunity. So many of the blood tests we do look for the immune reaction. But here we have the germ avoiding the reaction. I think Dr. Dempsey is going to talk about some of the cool new testing ideas that are under development to address this. And it can persist as a latent infection. Hey, the CDC just said, months later you could have trouble from Lyme. That's what they're also saying here, right? Only to reproduce and give rise to chronic disease. So when you're walking around town and somebody's like, oh, I've been dealing with Lyme disease for 6 or 8 months, you're like, that could probably be true. So one of the things we know is that patients with early disease who are recognized and treated early actually do pretty well. I agree with that. If someone comes with a new tick bite and they're on medicine, like 90% of them are gonna get over it, right? Treat them early. Long-term infection is complicated because the germ is difficult and evades the immune system. And it can include things like cystic germs and biofilms. As we already said, patients with late disease can have multi-organ system complaints and poor immune function. Like we said, a headache with joint pain, or fatigue and facial palsy, things like that. And Lyme has been reported in all 50 states. I don't think that's because there's ticks and white-footed mouse in all 50 states. It's because of people traveling, even the effect of birds, things like that. So one of my favorite mottos I tell patients is when treating Lyme disease, 1 + 1 does not always equal 2, right? It's not always just a perfect, clear-cut start in the beginning. So when we think about our immune system, and we've heard a lot about this in the news, treating infection, there are really 2 parts of our immune system. What we call the innate immunity, these are like the white blood cells, like respond to infection immediately. And then the adaptive immunity, which is the slow response. Like you remember when we talk to our friends with HIV, they always talk about what their T cell count is, right? That's this longer term. So in many patients, we have to think about what their innate response and their adaptive response is. Are you with me? There's going to be a quiz later, remember? One of the books we all read is called Harrison's Principles of Internal Medicine. People. It's a Saturday night in Bridgehampton. Snuggle down with Harrison's. You can find it online. It has got a really interesting read on Lyme disease, right? And they say to control and eradicate Lyme, you have these 2 immune responses, which gives us macrophage, white blood cell, and antibody to kill off the germ. In early disease, it's our innate response, those white blood cells. And then chemokines, which is reacting in the skin. So you're like, what exactly is he saying? You just have to remember there's a hell of a lot going on with your immune system, right? This I thought was really interesting, right? Our body is basically hardwired to recognize infection and react to it. And our white blood cells make infection, which is why we can get inflammation, right? And these immune cells help to kill germs. So we've used things like glutathione and low-dose naltrexone, which has been specifically shown to help with this innate immune response. Really cool. And then, again, when we're reading our book, right at the beginning of the Harrison's chapter, they're like, the Lyme germ is a strong and unusual bacteria. And it lives away from oxygen, right? When we breathe in oxygen, the germ tries to hide for that. In fact, a really interesting story, in the hospital, I was working with a patient in the PACU, post-anesthesia care unit, or the recovery room, and she was on oxygen because she wasn't feeling good, and she's like, I don't know what's with this oxygen, but it's one of the best things for my headache, right? And we know oxygen can help migraines, but looking at her history, she had joint pain and was a landscaper. So that little hint helped us to figure out her Lyme. The spirocheta's got a really small genome, and it has a very unusual chromosome, which basically means it can go really deep in the body because it's super, super small. Look at this, a quote from the book. The most remarkable aspect of the Lyme genome is there are sequences for more than 100 known or predicted proteins. Basically what they're saying is that there are multiple strains and the germ is much more diverse and different from pretty much any other bacteria we know. So patients can have multiple overlapping Lyme infections. And I've had some people, they're like, Simmons, I don't know what the heck's wrong with you. I did 3 weeks of doxy. I'm just as bad as I was 3 weeks ago. Like, well, Harrison says maybe try amoxicillin because you have a different strain of the Lyme. And then they call me back 2 weeks later. They're like, that was a perfect idea, right? Doxy just wasn't for me, right? And look at this. The spirochete has proteins with an activity that depends on the host for its nutritional response, right? So basically what that means is that the Lyme germ requires oxygen, right, to be able to feed, and nutrition. So here we go. What's our classic treatment, right? If you have an erythema migrans rash, or you have this acute Lyme disease, we start with doxycycline, typically for 10 days to 14 days, amoxicillin or cefuroxime like Ceftin. One of the things, if anybody in this room has taken doxy, you know that it can be really tough if you have to work outside in the sun, right? So things like amoxicillin sometimes are actually better. Kids, sometimes we may use doxycycline or amoxicillin or cefuroxime, right? So typically, you're gonna be on antibiotics for like 2 weeks out of the year. Another group called the Infectious, the International Lyme Disease Association gives up to 30 days for Lyme. So again, a couple of different opinions. If you have facial palsy, it's for 3 weeks, doxycycline, and facial palsy in kids is also for 3 weeks. So that's kind of like when you're doctor, PA, NP, it's the flu, somebody's got the flu in July and August, you're like, oh, you better take doxycycline just in case, right? Because there's so many, it works in a lot of ways, lots of different symptoms. Neurologic disease like meningitis, the shooting, radicular pain, we can use doxycycline orally for 2 or 3 weeks. IV Rocephin, that's what Justin Bieber was doing for 2 or 3 weeks. And very similar as well in kids. Dr. Coyle, who is on our Tick committee, says, I just give everybody 30 days. And this ILADS group also rounds this up to an even month. This I thought was really interesting. People, you're like, Jerry, I'm really getting into this. You got more? Don't worry, I've got more. This is really interesting. The Lyme germ depends on our nutrition to self-propagate it. And there's been several studies that show that the Lyme germ, which is a corkscrew, uses things like manganese, copper, and zinc to actually fuel itself. You following me? All these people come to me, they're like, oh, I'm coming to you because I have Lyme disease. I'm buying $300 of vitamins a month. It doesn't really seem to be helping. I'm like, okay, you're probably just feeding the Lyme germ, right? So, very important that, I have patients really restrict things like zinc, copper, manganese. And at Stanford, they did a really interesting study on desloratadine or Clarinex as a treatment for Lyme because it blocks some of these key minerals. So some of the doctors there and researchers said, rather than giving antibiotics, give something to basically starve the germ, which I thought was like really interesting, right? And they even published that 10 to 20% of people, the disease actually will persist over time, right? So when people are like, oh, I did 30 days of doxy, my Lyme must be gone, I'm like, well, 10 to 20% of people, it could persist, right? This was another study, so you're like, well, maybe I don't believe Stanford, they're just blowing hot air. Johns Hopkins did a competitive study which also showed that manganese, iron, copper, and zinc are what we call transition metals, which actually are like feeding the germ, right? So again, one of the things I look for when I'm treating people is if they have a high intake of these things, I'm like, maybe you better starve the germ. You don't need another month of antibiotics. And another really interesting study from the same lab at Johns Hopkins, they did a study where they took daptomycin, a very strong antibiotic, and compared it to essential oils. And they actually did a study where they found that a mixture of essential oils, again, this is in the lab, they didn't do human studies, but they found that essential oils help to go after Lyme disease as well as a famous antibiotic called daptomycin. So yeah, you're going to hear people taking Claritin, taking essential oils on 3 weeks of doxycycline, maybe switching to amoxicillin. These are all, more and more mainstream types of treatment. A lot of people are talking about an old drug for leprosy called Dapsone, which is an antibiotic, but it also is a really potent anti-inflammatory. When we talked about how the immune system works and it makes you inflamed, so there's been at least 3 studies on daptomycin. People get excited. This is not even published yet. It's going to be published in a few weeks, but you're getting an advanced preview for coming to SOFO today, right? On another possible treatment in people with post-treatment or persistent Lyme. So just briefly, a little bit more on the co-infections. Dr. Campbell really spoke about that. So we know that ticks are dangerous. They carry lots of different infections. Remember this, patients can have multiple infections and multiple strains of infection, what we call co-infection. And what I've seen is when you treat someone with doxycycline and they come back and they're still not better, it may be one of these other infections that are like lingering. And remember, even short attachment times are dangerous. Powassan virus has a 15-minute transmission and alpha-gal just as fast. Please get those Lone Stars off of you really quick. So one of the famous ones we have seen in Suffolk County is called Borrelia Miyamoto, which is a relapsing kind of a fever. So people may not get as many rashes, but they have a hot temperature and then it quiets down and then they have a hot temperature. I'm like, no, you're not 35 and menopause having hot flashes. You actually have Miyamoto. And we can actually do a test to look for this specifically. They have body and joint pain and fatigue, very rarely a rash. We can do things like a PCR to look for the germ and look at antibodies. The good news for you today, doxycycline also works for Miyamoto. Babesia, Dr. Campbell said exactly, it's related to malaria. Very interesting, it has up to a 9-week incubation period. What's our motto? Bit in September, sick in November, right? So we do see that sometimes. It can be very, very mild. In fact, we see more mild than severe disease, right? You can get a big liver and a big spleen. You can get jaundice from severe anemia and liver function. And sometimes you'll actually see the parasites floating around in the blood. So very interesting article on Borrelia Miyamoto, a widespread tick-borne relapsing fever, spirochete. And they actually found Borrelia Miyamoto as a relapsing fever in these Ixodes ticks. And very interesting, if you read this article, people, this is back in 2015. Ixodes carry numerous other microorganisms of unknown pathologic potential. So maybe in a year or two, when Frank has us come back and do this again here at SOFO, as long as you keep your donations coming so we stay open, make sure that, you might see a slide here that we've got even more tick germs to talk about, right? Another one, Rocky Mountain spotted fever. Like, we don't see this a lot, but like when we see it, we're like officially scared because Rocky Mountain spotted fever can kill you if we don't catch it early enough, right? Most people don't remember a tick bite. This is an interesting trivia point. First described in Ohio by a guy called Howard Rickett, who demonstrated that Rocky Mountain was an infectious disease. Anybody want to guess what disease did Howard Rickett die from? Rocky Mountain spotted fever, right? Because he was working with the ticks. He died from the disease that the rickettsial family that he was working with. Again, non-specific. Flu, headache, malaise, myalgia. People, if you're starting to drift off, just remember that all of these tick germs, fluey, achy, joint pain, right? Remember when Dr. Campbell was saying what days or what months the ticks are most endemic. Keep a really high index of suspicion. Me, my hot-headed opinion, I'd much rather give a week of doxy as we're trying to figure somebody out than realize like a week later maybe they should have gotten doxy. So again, there's that speckled rash that we're worried about and that wood tick. And again, both adults and kids get doxy. Now, new data actually shows pregnant women with Rocky Mountain can get doxy. Chloramphenicol, right? Like that's the old like 1900 something drug, but it's still around. We use that sometimes. Almost done. Anaplasma is the cousin of another tick germ called Ehrlichia. And it can present really sick people like Rocky Mountain. And again, they don't get a rash very often. Look at from the Merck Manual, another famous book that we like to read. Some patients continue to experience headache, weakness, and malaise for weeks, even after adequate treatment. It can be concurrent with Babesia and Ehrlichia. Now again, you may not know what summer flu a patient got from a tick, but doxycycline is generally a good choice. So these are a bunch of other diseases, tick paralysis, tularemia, right? Bartonella, the rickettsial diseases that we see sometimes, but we've really tried to cover the major ones. If you come to Southampton Hospital or any of the local doctor's offices, we actually can do, a panel where we look for Babesia, Bartonella, Anaplasma, Ehrlichia, and you know what, people? If you're at home watching this, write this down. If someone has Ehrlichia, Babesia, Bartonella, they probably have Lyme disease too. We just didn't really find it yet, right? So as a reminder, how do we diagnose Lyme? Signs and symptoms, possible exposure to a deer tick, and blood work when we need it. Those stages, as we said, we start with that rash, the neurologic, and the late neurologic, even years later, right? So again, trying to think of the timing. Just one other interesting story. Lyme is a spirochete, and as the germ is being broken up, sometimes you may feel worse before you feel better. So I've given people medicine, and they're like, Jerry, I don't know what you're doing to me, but my headache and joints are the worst ever. Very often that can be related to what's called the Jarisch-Herxheimer reaction, where your symptoms may actually temporarily flare up. In fact, the sister of Lyme disease, syphilis, another book we read, Current Medicine, says up to 60% of people can have this kind of reaction. So Dr. Campbell talked about how to remove a tick. Use that fine pointy tweezer, directly 90 degrees, get it right out. Try to keep it. Sometimes we will test ticks, depending on if we're worried about certain infections. Photograph the site, watch for symptoms. We will give antibiotics sometimes for deer ticks, engorged ticks that have been attached, especially overnight. One of the personal things I've told people with pretty good success, if you get a Lone Star tick, try to avoid eating any kind of meat for a month. If you got a Lone Star tick, if you don't introduce the trigger to that allergen, you might not trigger alpha-gal. So I'm kind of keeping unofficial records, but that's one easy tip. So when do we give prophylaxis, right? How many times do we hear this, right? A patient calls, I have a tick bite, I want antibiotics. Well, we already know that a dog tick and a Lone Star tick don't transmit Lyme. So we usually don't give antibiotics for that. We also know that those little larval ticks with 3 legs on each side typically don't transmit. So if I'm like, how many legs on the tick? Like, oh, 3 on each side. I'm like, oh, you really don't need anything, right? Many people will do 200 milligrams of doxycycline if they have that deer tick, which can prevent 87% of erythema migrans rashes, and we tell the other 13% of people to really stay on the alert, right? So we're still trying to figure out what the best treatment of a tick bite is, but if you've got a dog tick, if you've got a Lone Star tick, if you've got a larval tick, please don't start calling us for medicine, right? So when someone gets a tick bite, I kind of think of it as, stepping on a dirty needle, right? They live for 2 years, they can give you all kinds of infections. So in the future, like Dr. Campbell, I really like the 4-poster system. We've seen the number of infections really go down. Sag Harbor Press had a great article on that. Deer mitigation, spread the word, support the Tick Center. There is vaccine research out there. Eastern Long Island has some programs going. And really interesting, there's a big study at the NIH about the question of maternal fetal transmission of Lyme. If the mom has Lyme, is there a chance that the baby could get it? So there's actually really interesting research going on. Speaking of research, with Stony Brook, I'm doing a research program on fatigue and Lyme disease. People that have had fatigue associated with Lyme, we're actually doing several different exercise tests to be able to document if fatigue is a true manifestation of Lyme disease. So anybody with Lyme and you're tired, check it out, right? You can contact me. We might be able to enroll you in our aerobic capacity in patients with Lyme pilot study, which is pretty cool. Okay, here's our pop quiz. I'm gonna yell it out, but please feel free to yell it out with me. Ticks only make you sick if they're attached for 24 hours. False. Lyme is the only serious tick illness. False. Alpha-gal meat allergy can be deadly. That's true. I didn't really go over it, but you can get a serious anaphylaxis from that. CDC says a positive Lyme test is required. That's also false, right? A tick can give you more than one illness. Yep. A summer flu could be a tick illness. You can only get a tick bite in warm weather. False. 90% or more of people with Lyme get over it. I'm actually going to say that's true, but that 10% of people, if 100 people in Sag Harbor get Lyme in a weekend, 90 get over it, but 10% of people can have a long-term reaction. So those of you watching us as the recording, if you missed it, ticks only make you sick. False. Lyme is the only serious tick illness. False. Alpha-gal meat allergy can be deadly. True. Everyone with Lyme remembers a tick bite. False. CDC says a positive Lyme test is required. False. A tick can give you more than one illness. True. Summer flu. True. Tick bite in warm weather. False. 90% or more of people get over Lyme. I'm also going to say that's true. Just again, if you need it, you've got our phone number, you've got our email, so please reach out if you've got questions on that. And an old partner of mine, Dr. Dempsey, is going to fill us in on research and maybe talk a little bit about all the issues with testing and things like that. So I'll pass it right over to Dr. Dempsey.
It's good to see Jerry again. We've worked together for years. And I'm just going to be less formal of a slideshow. A lot of people are tired of looking at slides, and just more share experience and make it a little less formal as we move into our question and answer period. I've always been very involved in research since I was very young. And as I went into medicine, my dream has always been to actually do research out of a primary care setting. And that's what I've been doing for over 12 years. It's been quite a challenge to do both. And as you probably know, most research goes through universities where they get large grants and they have a full team of people totally devoted to writing for the grants, getting the funding. On the other side, though, they also don't necessarily want to share information with other research centers, and it's a very competitive type of environment. And as an example, they may have samples and tissue or other research materials that they don't share with other scientists. They also don't necessarily share data until they finally do their publishing. So what I got involved with is Lyme disease is a biobank. A biobank is where any kind of bodily or any kind of biological material is saved, banked, just like a blood bank, and then those material can then be used for research. There are very few actually in the United States. The United Kingdom actually has a very large effort with the biobank, and they also have a unified medical record system. So because of this unified system, they have data on their whole population, and they can query it and get information that we can't because of our disjointed healthcare system. And part of my mission has been trying to deal with that. So a biobank allows multiple scientists to work together and share data and share specimens. So starting in 2014, I've worked with the Bay Area Lyme Foundation, and this is a not-for-profit. And as most people know, there isn't a lot of funding for Lyme disease, so a lot of important research is done through the few non-for-profits that are dedicated to this, and usually they're by families who are suffered from it and have the means to make it a cause and fund it. In this case, we started in 2014, and it started at my office in East Hampton. Since then, it has grown to Wisconsin, the Marshfield Clinic, and even on the West Coast, where this actually foundation started near Stanford, because on the West Coast, people don't know about Lyme, and so they had severe cases. Going back a little bit clinically to my own experience, and Jerry knows as well, is that we see people early, our community is highly sensitive to it, and because of that, in treating people early, rarely do I see chronic Lyme cases out of our population. And that's the good news. In fact, I think in a lot of ways we treat it so early that I personally have not seen a lot of, even that 10% of people that have persisting symptoms, I really haven't seen a lot of that either. Now there could be a lot of theories behind this. One of my theories is based on the fact that we know that even within Lyme Borrelia, there's many different species and what we call genotypes. And those are specific to every little ecosystem around the country. And I know that, for example, in John Aucott's study in Johns Hopkins, they have a certain percentage of people that have ongoing chronic symptoms. But it could also be that they're different strains. In a typical tick, they can carry several strains of Lyme disease, not just one type. And we really are in their infancy of even beginning to understand what that means. But in your blood test, even if you pick up an antibody, you're not going to know what strain it is. Hopefully it's a strain that creates an immune response that you get an antibody for. So this is an example how we're in our infancy. So going back to what I'm doing is that we are dealing with the very beginnings of infections. When someone first comes in, they can volunteer, donate blood, urine, and that will be stored. And then out of that single donation, there'll be 50 different research studies from one donation. So it's very productive. The biobank has a board of scientists. They basically vet out who wants to apply to use the samples. the ones that they think is a worthwhile cause and that they are good researchers, they would approve them to use the samples. And there you get 50 studies out of one donation. Now as of now, there's at least 70 studies that have been out. So what they're looking at especially is what happens early on to the immune system, which is Jerry referred to as the innate immune response. And they're studying that early immune response and what happens before antibodies develop. Because as we know, it takes weeks for antibodies to develop and you can't diagnose infection early. So these kind of markers, and the immune system is very complex. I think we've learned that with COVID, that you have to find these particular markers and unique immune responses that are very particular to Lyme. And this application occurs in immunology and infectious disease, applies to COVID. Some of the labs have actually done research on COVID using the same technology that they're using for Lyme. So the research also expands into general immunology and infectious disease. So that's what makes me excited, is that I'm also creating the idea of a biobank for a community. So that research can be done in a community where the community has its own environment, its own diseases. And then going forward, the biobank can become the community resource for research. So in a way, it's like decentralization, what we know about blockchain. It decentralizes research and allows it to occur for the individual within their community. So this is kind of my dream that I've thought of over many years and I'm trying to develop here. So it goes beyond Lyme disease. As I've got into this, and what really got me from the very beginning interested in Lyme is really pure frustration. And it's so difficult to understand it. It's easy in the beginning, but once it gets out of the bag, the symptoms, you're feeling sick. It's very hard to say this is a Lyme symptom, so across the board. So what I began to look into is really ticks. And ticks themselves are just incredibly complex and interesting, and they follow evolution for millions of years. They are way more sophisticated than most of us realize. They have their own immune system, they have their own internal biology that's very complex that we really don't have a good knowledge of. Once they attach, the level of reactions and the series of events that occur is a wonder. From the very beginning, they'll numb your skin so you don't even feel it's there. They penetrate, you don't even know it's there. If you had a splinter and you would notice it within an hour, it would be starting to bother you and starting to itch or become painful. So then they have things that they create a blood pool. So they have enzymes that open up the blood vessels, break it open until they create a blood pool. Then they have things that block cytokines and other parts of the immune system, so there's no inflammatory reaction and there's nothing fighting what's going on inside. It's not rejecting them. And as they insert whatever they want, whatever the type of disease it is, it stays and is able to then transmit. So it's almost like a football team with a line, and it opens a hole and goes in. This has not just happened last week. This has been happening since even the dinosaur time. So this is a very sophisticated immune response with our skin. From that, I began to look at ticks and go, what else is in them? There's a lot of things in them. And in particular, I've gotten very interested in viruses. And because we know from COVID, virus is not as easy as a bacteria. And frankly, I find that even though they're simpler, they're just little DNA wrapped around in a protein, they create more complex types of symptomatology, and they do things in the body that's way more invasive. Most bacterial infections, it's localized in the area, you treat and it goes away. Lyme is a hybrid. It's more subtle, and so we know that, but viruses are even more so. Stepping back and looking at COVID, we don't even understand all the types of manifestation it has. But one of my greatest concerns of COVID is the neurotropism, and neurological tropism means the desire to invade it and the effects of it on our population, the effects on our brain. And that is my biggest concern. And it's not necessarily related to the severity of symptoms. So neurotropic viruses are quite common, and even within ticks there are, and that includes the Powassan virus. Another one is the West Nile virus, which is not in ticks, but it's in insects. And as I looked into this, I got more and more interested about what else could be people feeling sick from. Because yes, there is the whole confusion about if someone has a positive blood test or not for Lyme. But then if it's negative blood test, but you say you got the symptoms of Lyme, and they treat them and they don't get better, my question is, maybe it's not Lyme. What about these other things? Well, if you get West Nile virus, you could have fever in the summer, never get diagnosed, but that can have neurological effects for years. And you can feel lousy, depressed, fatigue. So it can happen from other types of viruses and organisms in our environment. So my biggest interest is really starting to investigate all of the diseases that ticks carry, and then also investigate the immune system that responds to them. As you know, an example is that the alpha-gal meat allergy, it's not an infection, it's an immune response. What other immune responses are there from a tick that's not infection? That's what is going on when it enters the skin. For example, alpha-gal exists in meat, but if we eat it, we don't have meat allergy unless we have it exposed to the skin, because that's a different part of the immune system. It causes reactions that affect the body, but through the gut, it doesn't. So we're highly complex. The skin is a fascinating area of the body and how it affects the rest of us, our barrier to the environment. So I feel that the interface between an insect and a human through the skin is an area in its infancy. And then it's also an introduction into what our immunology is throughout the course of our lives. And from the day we're born, the exposures we have, and how our immune system evolves. Another interesting things, and I'm kind of a little bit going around things, but they're just thoughts that I've had for a long time. As we mentioned that the Colorado tick fever is a cultivirus. And this is just to give an example that I don't think ticks themselves are bad. They serve other purposes that we don't yet understand. The cultivirus is in the family of a reovirus. And the reovirus is the closest thing that really affects us would be rotavirus, which is a diarrhea illness in children. But otherwise, it's a very benign virus, and there hasn't been many problems with it. What's interesting, though, is this type of virus, the cultivirus, actually goes into tumor cells, and it suppresses cancer tumors, especially in the brain. So we may find one day that certain tick bites lower the risk of cancer, but be as it may, it's kind of tongue-in-cheek, but it's also saying that the biology of ticks affecting us is so underappreciated. We do know that these real viruses are now being used in cancer research as vectors to treat cancer. So it's taken seriously, and they can be used because they have an ability and a desire to go after tumor-type cells. And that's a whole area of cancer research that's being done, which makes it just interesting how our natural biology leads into understanding of other things in medicine. So back to the biobank. It's a continuing effort. We're expanding our sites for volunteers and collections to Riverhead. As well, we're very dedicated to the Latino population, as they're the highest risk with their outdoor work. And we're hoping to collect even more samples this summer, especially. What's kind of interesting is that during the pandemic, as you saw from the slides, that there was a big drop in all the tick diseases. And I'm still trying to figure out why, when everyone was out here tromping around who knew nothing about ticks, but we didn't have a spike in tick disease. And I don't have an answer to that question per se. But the other thing I've noticed, and if you probably weren't watching the way I was with Dr. Campbell's slides, that Lyme disease has steadily been declining over the past 5 to 7 years. And it's not like a bump up and down, it's a steady reporting decline. It's very stable, so to speak. It may be the way we report, perhaps. It may be that we're diagnosing it without reporting. It could be a lot of things, but it makes you kind of wonder. One of my thoughts is, though, is that the Lone Star tick has become so prevalent. And as Dr. Campbell said, it goes after you. It doesn't sit as an optimistic deer tick hanging on a branch just waiting for you to come by. It'll seek you out from yards away. I know myself, and we don't even have ticks where we are, but we took our dog just outside our office for literally outside on the grass, and she had a tick pulled off this morning, one yesterday, and I got one on me that's still itching, and that's just for taking our puppy outside my office for a few minutes to pee and go back in. So these are all Lone Stars. And what we do in the office, something that I've initiated a number of years ago, is we have a microscope, we look at the ticks, and by knowing the type of tick, we can help people counsel or decide what to do if they need treatment not for their tick bite. Since this Lone Star has started around 2000, they said 2000, but I say the past 6 to 8 years, it has just accelerated. We identify ticks on a daily basis. I say the majority, I wouldn't be surprised if I were to say 19 out of 20 of the ticks that I see when people bring it in are Lone Star. I hardly even see deer ticks these days. I don't mean they don't exist. I'm saying the Lone Star is so much more aggressive that the number of people coming in with a tick bite is Lone Star, which shows how successful they are. They're much more successful creatures at biting us and humans. So the Lone Star is really, in my mind, my focus of what does it carry, such as the viruses that Dr. Campbell mentioned, or what else does it do, creating allergies and so forth. So we identify ticks, and that really helps a lot. And yeah, so we do that on a regular basis. It really helps diminish anxiety because so many of the tick bites are not going to carry Lyme. And a lot of research helps. It helps avoid overuse of antibiotics and all the effects on your gut and your microbiome. So what I'm doing with some medical students is we've been publishing based on the database that I have, because I've had electronic medical record over the past 20 years, and I've taken photos ever since 2000. We have about 1,400 cases of Lyme in the database and a lot of photos. So we're compiling a whole app that we're going to try and be a teaching app for residents and other physicians to identify Lyme rashes. And whereas actually another study through the Marshfield Clinic, we're going to actually have a published article on comparing a dermatologist in one area and myself here. We're blinded looking at rashes trying to say, is this Lyme or not? Which is not so easy. But it's an interesting article to see that. The key thing though is most rashes, 6% I think it was, that actually were a bullseye. And the other ones were just red, different kind of blotchy types of rashes. And a lot of them ended up being Lyme. So yeah, I think a lot of people are fooled by that and they're thinking it has to be a certain look to it. But basically I would say anything that's larger than, yay, I'm saying an estimate, but a silver dollar, and it's starting to change or starting to increase in size. And then if you start not feeling good, of course, but if it's starting to increase in size, that should be looked at. And you'd be wonderful to join our study if you'd like. Now, when you get someone though at that stage, you treat them early. It's done. It's really to me, from my experience, it's a non-issue. And thank gosh in our community that we're like that. So education is something that really needs to be propagated a lot further. Let's see what else I can do. Talking about, one of the things is the guidelines of the Infectious Disease Society. And I mean, there's certain people going to be listening and watching this who are very deeply into this and the controversies about testing appropriately or whether a test is accurate or not and going into all different labs and so forth. So this is such a Pandora's box. But I want to remind people that it's opposed to taking sides, that the Infectious Disease Society of America is some kind of conspiracy and, that doesn't want to believe in Lyme versus other people that says, that it's another problem, to realize when you talk about a guideline, they were just guidelines. And I think we learned from COVID is that science is not exact. And a guideline isn't the law. It isn't the Bible. It's just giving you a guidance. So I have some people who've had a mild case of COVID and you say, okay, 5 days and then you wear a mask. But some of them are so mild that I know they're not going to be doing anything exposing people. After 4 days, I may say, you know what, you're fine. This is what we do when we're physicians and we're trained, and we kind of can deal with the uncertainty that most of the frustration with COVID is not knowing how to make it so perfect exact. And the same thing with regarding any disease, and including Lyme disease, is you have to be flexible. And you can't just say this is this and that's that. So you might have noticed even between Dr. Campbell and Jerry, one was 36 hours, the other one was 24 hours. When does it transmit? None of this is exact. That's what it's saying. And so part of it's comfort level and how we feel about it. If we have a lot of experience in something, we see some terrible cases, we tend to be more aggressive, and that's human nature. It's not right or wrong. And I think the main thing is not to get so caught up in exact numbers, and he said this way and they said that way. Back off and realize that medicine is not exact, and you go where your comfort level is. So I have some people with a tick bite, they're extremely anxious, fine. I'm not going to try and create a logical argument because we're not logical beings. But if someone is like, I don't want to take any antibiotics, fine, let's wait. We'll watch. If you get symptoms, we'll test. If you have symptoms, we're more likely to know that you have something because that's when the blood tests work. They don't work before you have the disease. So I'm flexible when working with people all different ways, and I found that it works for all people in different ways. So that's the art of medicine, and I think people have to be able to realize, at least in this community, that most of the people, physicians working in this community, know what to do and have faith in the system. That for the most part, I think we're doing a pretty good job out here. And I just want that to be for reassurance. I could go on, but maybe we should have the session. I just giving experiences and thoughts as I've been doing this for quite a while. And we've had a lot of different people in the business or in the field of trying to deal with Lyme and tick disease that I know there's a lot of confusion. And I think there should no longer be this kind of opposition about all these concepts. Everyone should just be together, engaging and discussing. I think we're finally getting to that time now. And I have to commend that the tick panel at Southampton has begun to take in other ideas and be more embracing rather than the ivory tower, classic, scientific method versus what we call anecdotal, but sometimes maybe has some validity and really exploring things. So hopefully this is going to be a good time for all of us to move ahead, but it's in its infancy, this whole thing is. So thank you. Here you go.
You can stay.
We go through, okay.
So I'd like to ask everyone who presented today to come up to the table. We'll do a little question and answer and maybe some final thoughts before we move on. So before we transition to this next phase of the event, I just want to thank Karen Wolfred and Stony Brook Medicine for donating a lot of these Tick-Borne Disease reference handbooks. They're available at the Southwark Natural History Museum. They're free, and I think they're very informative and very a nice reference book to learn more about tick-borne disease. So, does anybody have any questions out there for the panel speakers? So, Chuck, maybe speak loud. We only have one microphone, so maybe just I think the acoustics in here are good enough for the microphone to.
I have a couple of them. One for Jerry. You're talking about Ferguson. And I know I've had chronic Lyme for some colleges, so I've had to come through Dr. Detmeyer, on studies and everything else. And my company, we always got tested. But having suffered from it, and babesiosis, got that too, I think, Rocky Mountain spot. The only one I'm missing is Ehrlichia, I think, and alpha-gal. But herxing, when you have chronic Lyme, it seems over a period of time, maybe it could be a couple of months or twice a year, you start that same feeling again of, fatigue, headache, the same symptoms you had, and it'll last for, 4 or 5 days and it'll go away. Is that something that's in your head, or is that something that the spirochetes are actually still within you, that your body's fighting it, you have immunity, and they're dying or releasing the toxins again?
Right, so for you guys at home, the question was about herxing, and we know that Jarisch Herxheimer with spirochetal disease, both syphilis and Lyme, can occur during treatment, and usually that's whatever symptoms you're being treated for tends to kind of recur. Number two, when you read that article from Benjamin Left, where he talked about this concept of Lyme possibly being able to reproduce or like come back. Like I had someone who was rear-ended and got whiplash and then started feeling, joint pain and like facial numbness and tingling. So there is research out there about after you get over Lyme, is there this post-Lyme immune response? Is there original infection left in cyst and biofilm? So your story is not unusual. I've certainly heard it. And there is lots of interesting research going on about that, even right here from Stony Brook. So scientifically, that is a possibility. So maybe Dr. Dempsey has something to add.
I guess the main thing to realize is that when we feel bad, it's not the organism that's making us feel bad directly, it's our immune response. An example, especially in the 80s and 90s, when we saw a lot of folks with AIDS, their immune system was wiped out. They come in and they go, I don't feel good. And, they were teeny, not even barely a fever. And they were on death's door. You had to send them to the hospital right away because the organism had already spread through the body. So you need your immune system. And most of what goes wrong with us, how we're feeling, is our immune system, even from day to day, a good day or a bad day. Something's going on. But as we know, we're constantly being exposed. This is what we are. We're not in a sterile environment here. And that's why we feel good or bad. So we're always fighting something off. And I think the COVID's kind of taught us, gee, I felt fine, but I have COVID. But I just had a mild illness. Well, if we weren't doing all this testing, we wouldn't even think about it. And whenever everyone was wearing masks, and we wiped out the flu for a year, next year, influenza B is gone. We don't see influenza B anymore. We wiped that one out, it seems. But at the same time, where everyone's wearing masks, they took off the mask, and all of a sudden everyone's getting sick all over the place, and they weren't getting better because the little virus lasted for weeks. So yeah, we're just one big immune system. That's all we can say. So to answer a question like what you're saying here, what's going on inside, it's just, I couldn't even begin to say. It makes me think of so many things could be going on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough, but it's.
Yeah, but it could
actually happen.
Yeah, it's real. It's what are you feeling? Whatever we feel is real, no question about it. Is it the biofilm that's shaking around and setting off some reverberations? Or is it our immune system that's just something triggered it to kind of say we're going to hold it down and we're fighting it off, keep it in its place? I mean, those are all possibilities. It's just so hard to measure it. That's the challenge. That's the controversy.
Another question. Your biobank that you're doing, and you say you're targeting people that are outside all the time. Do you have any place you can sign up on it? And again, my business, ecological business, everybody works with is in the field all the time. Every day you're in the field. And it would seem like they'd be the perfect people to have in that. And do you have to, or you have gotten Lyme, or are you taking people who have the potential for getting it too, as kind of a control that we're out?
We like 50-50 is control. So better not someone's had Lyme because then they already have different immunology. But somebody hasn't had it, but they live in this area, that would be a good control.
Those are the people that you haven't had who have the chance of being exposed to it.
That would be half. The other half would be people that are early. They have a rash or they're feeling sick. They got the summer sickness and we suspect it. That's the other group.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question. Rebecca, since you deal with all the phone calls for the Tick Center, I hear a lot out here, people will call me because they're with my line. They say they got bitten by a tick, and the tick is on them, and they're afraid to take it off. And I'm sure you get those calls. What do you do when somebody calls up and says they have a tick, and they're afraid to take it off? How do you direct those people?
Well, that's a good question. I can get as many as 800 calls in a summer, and they range anywhere from, I have a tick on me, what do I do, to, I've been sick for 10 years, I've seen 3 neurologists, I've seen infectious disease, I've traveled to other countries, I've tried alternative, so it runs the whole gamut. I try to have on the ready the guidelines that you were talking about. I mean, they're not absolutes, to help guide them through wherever it is, whatever problem they're having. They can talk through their labs with me so we can try to understand that. If it's a tick, then I give them the way, I guess it was Scott outlined how you remove a tick. I'm very specific about it. I had one patient that said, well, I waited for 2 days to go to the ER so I could have a professional take it out. So there's a lot of misinformation, and so then I will let them know that the longer the tick's on you, the more likely you're gonna get sick. Well, I put a match on it, well, that's not a good idea either, because then the tick can eject the bacteria, things like that. General guidelines of what Scott was talking about. So it's interesting, but you get a lot of.
So you're able to walk somebody through.
You have to walk through, and everybody has a different story and a different thing, and maybe they have a different medical background, and they want so bad for it to be Lyme disease so they can take a medicine and get better, But it's just not that simple. So we talk for hours about it.
I have one follow-up question. I didn't hear anybody in the panel talk about nutrition and Lyme disease. Not thinking about sugar and nutrition, because I did another talk here, and I had somebody who wrote a book called Recipe for Repair, and she worked with, I think it was Dr. Singleton, who wrote a book on Lyme disease. And a big part of the book was about nutrition, about how key that is for people who are suffering with Lyme. And I can say for myself, who's had it, that nutrition was a really key thing for me with reducing sugar. The more sugar I ate, the worse I felt, which is probably true for other illnesses. But.
Right, yeah, the question on nutrition, and that goes for anybody who's sick. Are they sleeping? What's your diet like? Are you able to exercise, move your body? You could, take the most expensive medicine like Yolanda Hadid and Justin Bieber, but if you're eating white bread and, sleeping through the disease. So yeah, we always are talking sleep, diet, exercise with almost everybody, but specifically nutrition for today, I think what SOFO wants you to remember is these transition elements, iron, manganese, copper. Multiple studies now on both coasts have shown that could actually feed the germ. So, and you'll save a lot of money on vitamins. So.
Back there.
Right, so this is another personal story. I recently had a Lyme test, it was negative. But the reason I had a Lyme test wasn't because I had a tick, it was because I suddenly have a damaged and attenuated phrenic nerve, and I have like 80%, I have 20% left of my right phrenic nerve. It's not dead, but it's limping along. And it's resulted in significant decreased pulmonary function, right? About 73%. Half of my phrenic diaphragm on this side is up to here. So they did a Lyme test, and that makes sense. Number one, so the question, one, how reliable is one Lyme test? And two, is it worth going back to my Stony Brook internist who had ordered this and say maybe we should look at some other Lyme tests as well, or tick tests as well?
What gives you symptoms and what kind of is a sign of that immune response to the disease. So yeah, we always are talking sleep, diet, exercise with almost everybody, but But specifically nutrition for today, I think what SOFO wants you to remember is these transition elements, iron, manganese, copper. Multiple studies now on both coasts have shown that that could actually feed the germ. So, and you'll save a lot of money on vitamins. So.
That's good information.
Right, so, this is another personal story. I recently had a Lyme test, it was negative. But the reason I had a Lyme test wasn't because I had a tick, it was because I suddenly have, a damaged and attenuated phrenic nerve, and I have like 80%, well, I have 20% left of my right phrenic nerve. It's not dead, but it's limping along, and it's resulted in like, significant decreased pulmonary function, right? About 73%, half of my phrenic diaphragm on this side is up to here. So they did a Lyme test, and that makes sense. Number one, so the question, one, how reliable is one Lyme test? And two, is it worth going back to my Stony Brook internist who reported this and say maybe we should look at some other Lyme tests as well, or tick tests as well?
Right, so her question was on neurologic disease and Lyme, which we definitely know that Lyme can affect your nervous system, both the central nervous system, like vagus, phrenic nerve, facial nerve, and the peripheral nervous system as well. Typically, when we think about Lyme, we look at what's called the ELISA, which is our basic screening test, and we can follow that up with what's called a Western blot, which can look for older and active markers. So kind of the golden rule is if the ELISA is positive or borderline, we would follow that up then with a Western blot. So typically if you're at Stony Brook, Southampton, or the Stony Brook Lyme Lab, they would start with what we call an ELISA, and then reflex it automatically go to the Western blot test. So I think your homework for tonight is to see what test you have, and if it's an ELISA, we would typically then follow it up with one of these other types of testings.
Right, but if the ELISA was negative, end of story?
Not necessarily. There's a lot of data that shows that, especially if you don't have systemic symptoms, like flu, fatigue, fever, then the ELISA may miss it. So sometimes certain ELISA testings will see a number, usually 0.9 or less is negative, but some labs will give us 0.5, 0.6, and we can look to see how the number changes over time. Actually, Rutgers did some data studies on the ELISA, looking particularly at the number. So if 0.9 and more is positive, if you're 0.67 and then 3 months later you're 0.89, that's kind of an upward trend. And again, that's controversial, but that's one way that we might look at that. There's other Lyme testings like PCRs, and we can find Lyme in the skin in patients with neuropathy and rashes. So yeah, there's more than just the ELISA, and we will sometimes do this staged ELISA as well.
Staged over time?
Right. Anything to add on that?
This is the most frustrating and hardest part about it, and this is why I've been trying to get into this. And I think Jerry and I have had this yin and yang about what is a positive test and not. I've always been more, vast majority of the time, it's a robust response, so it's not just a little bit maybe. And Jerry is more on the side that even a little bit, it could be. But either way, if you have a disease that's significant, why not look at everything?
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with treating it for Lyme, because the treatment's not as bad as the disease. So, ultimately, I think we're in agreement that you gotta treat the person. That's the final, that's the final
Because this is
thing.
just a snapshot. A year from now, I could have 5% left. Or on the other hand, I could regenerate and I'd have 40%. But I think, I'd like to figure out what I could proactively do now, where I am right now.
And repeating the test can be helpful, because over time, for most of the time, the antibody response increases.
Okay.
It gradually rises over time. Even over a year or two, it steadily increases. everything, the immune response keeps developing, it's like an army, keeps building more soldiers. So repeating it is always advisable.
And with what periods
It can be weeks.
oh,
Yeah, it tends to evolve. It evolves, so even a few weeks you'll be able to see a difference. If it's a new infection,
yeah, I don't know.
we don't know. I know, it's tough, very tough.
Thank you.
Couple of questions.
I have a question regarding the immune system and tick bite of the meat tick disease that you mentioned, Dr. Dempsey. So everybody's immune system is a little different. So if mine is weaker or whatever, I don't know what the difference would be with that kind of a disease, Lyme disease. Does that mean only people who suffer in an immune system type of issue get the disease, the meat-borne?
No, an allergy is not a weakness.
Okay.
An allergy is a sensitivity, like poison ivy. You're not weak, you actually overreact. It's an immune pattern. It's more of a pattern than a weakness.
Okay, so you said that the people that get the meat borne type of disease is more of an immune type of issue. Is that, am I understanding that?
The best analogy is poison ivy. Some people react to poison ivy and some don't. And some people will get the alpha-gal allergy and some won't. There's a lot of it. I get more of that now with mine. Oh my gosh, there's so much alpha-gal now. It's
What
really.
about the other types of Lyme? Are they kind of similar that way? Is it about the immune system more than?
I mean, what do we know about Lyme and whether you're susceptible to it?
Yes.
I wish we knew. That's what we're trying, it's exactly what we're trying to do in the early stages to see what's going on. But we're in our infancy for that. It's complex. It's like looking at a city with the managers and the lawyers and the businesses and trying to go in and say, this leads all the way to that. It's just so complicated. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, could you clarify, is Lyme the most serious disease of all these? You listed many tick diseases from different kinds of ticks, bacterial and virus and pathogens. Are we focusing so much on Lyme? Is it because it's the most serious of the diseases?
I'm going to give you a little chance.
I'm not a physician, but Lyme is important because it's the most prevalent disease. There's more Lyme cases nationally and in Suffolk County than there are the other diseases, but all diseases are serious, and that's why they're all reportable. So you want to prevent tick bites so you can prevent all diseases, because all of them will cause disease and make a person sick.
Thank you.
Well, we're hoping on getting a tick vaccine. I think that's in development. And that would be most effective than one vaccine for each disease. So that's what's being looked at.
23andMe, you know, it was doing this 23andMe and doing their DNA research. Is that an avenue for Lyme? I mean, so I guess, you know, they look at your DNA profile and they say what things from your DNA you are susceptible to. I recently got a question about Lyme disease, you know, you've been exposed. So I'm wondering if that's going to be an avenue for kind of maybe creating a model for, you know, what is the DNA, you know, who is more susceptible.
It's an exciting time because now we have data coming from other places that can all be integrated. Then if you have a biobank of a community and you have this other data, you can get to so granular that someone goes to the Stop and Shop instead of IGA and you start making these correlations. So that's the age we're in where research can begin with you from you going out rather than out going in. That's what I'm excited about. It's a lot, but I mean, technology, artificial intelligence, all this stuff is on the cusp of happening.
Great.
I have a question for Scott. Because you were talking about the four-poster system, which is great, but my recollection, my experience is that DEC, especially in upstate New York, the powers to be were adamantly opposed to it in those places because you're feeding the deer, increasing the deer population. Has that changed at all? Because I know you mentioned North Haven has one in Fire Island because it's a limited population, if you will. It seemed to work pretty well.
Right, right,
but-
so their concern is chronic wasting disease and bringing deer together and having
Right.
deer-specific diseases affecting the deer population.
Right.
Chronic wasting disease is the main one that I understand as being the one that they're concerned about. So there are restrictions now that have all landowners around the land that holds these units, they need to approve the unit, the four-poster for being on that land. So unless it's so large like the state park, then it's not a factor. But these restrictions have been, are preventing four-posters to being deployed in some areas, especially on the east end.
But they haven't allowed it to be on, let's say, private farms or surrounded by residential areas, or it's
Correct,
just still
it's on a
public-
municipal or agency level, so parks can deploy four posters, towns can deploy four posters, but four posters are not allowed in just one homeowner. Yeah, and it probably works better in multiple units anyway. You know, the more coverage you get, it's probably better, more effective at reducing the tick populations rather than just having one unit in one location.
Any other questions? Maybe Rebecca, before we conclude, can you just give everybody information who's watching at home, how to contact the hospital, and maybe, I'm sure there's gonna be a lot of questions.
631-726-TICK.
Oh, that's everything right there.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, we have some materials out here. We've got our tick kit, which Jerry mentioned. I have some up there, but you can call me and leave your address and or email if you want to come to some presentations, and we will gladly send you out. We're going to send you out a tick reference handbook. We won an award for that. We're very proud of it. It's a lot of good information. A lot of the stuff you've heard today is in there. The doctors that we generally use, the ones I refer to, are there with their particular point of view. And if you have a question, if you have a tick on, you can feel free to call. You can call anytime, and I'll get back to you.
Thank you. Very informative presentation. Thank you, everyone, for being here.